Thank you very much, Grant, and thank you very much all for coming. And I'm talking about Aleppo this evening as a city, not. Let's get away from countries and races and religions, which have done so much harm. And cities have their own dynamism, and very few cities were as dynamic as Aleppo. Location, population, and wealth give them the power to ignore or defy a state. They are economic, social, and cultural organisms whose inhabitants exploit each other, but also need each other, or they would not be living there. You cannot choose the country you are born in. You can choose the city you live in. And Paris, for example, was often the motor of events in France, much more than the French government. And Aleppo, in particular, here, was a city with a rhythm of its own, challenging categories. It lies between the desert and the sea, the mountains of Anatolia and the banks of the Euphrates. It was at the same time Arab and Turkish, Kurdish and Armenian, Muslim, Christian and Jewish. An Arabic-speaking city with a Muslim majority. Nevertheless, under the Ottoman Empire, it also became a center of French culture and Catholic and American missions and schools. So it mixed East and West, Islam and Christianity, and until 2012, if there's one thing that made Aleppo different, it was its peaceful character. For 500 years, whatever their origins, its inhabitants lived together relatively harmoniously. And I want to speak about it really as one of the great cities of the Levant, which were distinguished not only by geography, by being on or near the Eastern Mediterranean, but also by the prominence of diplomacy and consuls, the vital importance of trade, polyglotism, many different languages in the same city, and this extraordinary balance between different communities. And unfortunately, as we all know, Levantine cities are also distinguished by their vulnerability. And what really started Aleppo's boom in the 16th century was the Ottoman conquest. Yavuz Sultan Selim, 1516, he comes down, he's fighting a Muslim state, the Mamelukes of Egypt, and at Marj Darbig, north of Aleppo, where ISIS, Daesh, thought they would have the last battle with Roman forces. So it's prophesied in the Quran. That is where Selim defeated the Mameluke forces from Egypt. He'd already bought the loyalty of the Egyptian commander and entered Aleppo. There was 400 years, from 1516 to 1918, Aleppo was an Ottoman city, and Damascus was quite restless. There were revolts, quite keen on Arab identity. Aleppo was not. And it's the only Arabic-speaking city where Ottoman sultans regularly lived. That is an early Ottoman view by Matrukci Nasu of the, recognize the citadel of Aleppo. That's in the mid-16th century. And this is Yavuz Selim's son, the great Suleiman the Magnificent. 3 times he lived in Aleppo. Why Aleppo? Because it's a very good winter base for Ottoman armies in their frequent wars with the great Shia state of Iran. There is nothing new about Shia-Sunni conflict. The Ottomans and the Iranians, they were at it for years. And lots of persecution, hatred of Persian pilgrims. It's in the documents. They feared already then Persians going on pilgrimage to Mecca. And Aleppo is a natural winter base. And not just Suleiman, but also Murad IV in the 17th century, during his wars against Iran, spent the winter in Aleppo. And there is a story by a German traveller, Leonhard Rauwolf, about Suleiman the Magnificent in Aleppo. Maybe it's 1536. I don't guarantee its authenticity, but it was going around. And there was a proposal to expel Jews from Aleppo. There was a very ancient, prosperous, quite small Jewish community in Aleppo. And Suleiman said that his advisors should consider the flower pot in the room. It held a quantity of fine flowers of diverse colours, and bid them consider whether each of them in their colour did not set out the other the better. The more nations I have in my dominions under me, Turks, Arabs, Greeks, etc., the greater authority they bring to my kingdoms and make them more famous. I think it convenient that all that have been together hitherto may be kept and tolerated so still for the future. And his council, of course, agreed unanimously. And that is a key to why the Ottoman government survived so long. Although there were horrible episodes, terrible moments, nevertheless, the base of the empire was this belief in diversity. And you see it in the recruitment of the army, which is often Slav, in the repeopling of Constantinople. And many Ottoman texts talk about diversity. So at a time when almost all European cities penalized religious minorities and threw them out, Aleppo contained Muslims, Christians, and Jews. They mostly lived near the mosque, church, or synagogue, but there were no legally enforced ghettos, and there were some mixed quarters, some mixed guilds and businesses. And after the Ottoman conquest, the proportion of Christians rose to about 20% by 1700. And also the different law courts were used by different sects sometimes. For example, some Christians used Muslim courts, Sharia courts, for legal inheritance because it was easier to pass money to their daughters than in Christian courts. And I'll just give you a few quotes by a British consul, John Barker. He said, "Men of different creeds live in perfect peace and not infrequently in relations of the closest friendly intercourse." And he noticed more antipathy between Sunni and Shia than between Muslims and Christians. And to show you the mixtures in Aleppo, this is a photograph of the room from Beit al-Wakil, the first, and now in Berlin in the Museum of Islamic Art. And it is decorated, you see animals, you see faces, there is a Quranic date, there are stories of Mary and Jesus and Anta and Abla, the Arab lovers, and it really proves this diversity. And it was built for a Christian family around 1606, because already Christian merchants of Aleppo were among the richest, and they had these incredible houses which have just been devastated in the Civil War. That shows you some of the figures in the decoration. This room was removed in about 1909, and it is now in Berlin. Mercifully, it has been saved by its removal. And this is another house, I think it's Beit Ghazaleh. These are panels which are all gone now. All the old houses have been looted and half destroyed. And another thing that distinguished all Levantine cities, and particularly Aleppo, is the presence of foreign consuls who help run international trade and run local courts and enable French or English or Venetians or Dutch to function in Aleppo as they did in Istanbul, Izmir, and Alexandria. And the main foreign power was where we are today, France. The main force, or one of the only lasting alliances in European history, is the French-Ottoman alliance. Both sides were rather hypocritical about it, saying they never allied with the infidel, but of course they did. It was very useful for attacking Austria. And this picture shows the Marquis de Nointel. He's in fact in front of Athens, then an Ottoman city. And it's a series of pictures he commissioned showing him going around the Ottoman Empire. And there was one of him in Aleppo, but it's disappeared. Maybe it'll reappear. And he's going around in 1673 enforcing the fermans of the Sultan, which say that foreigners can live and trade and even worship in the consulate freely. And it was probably the city with the oldest permanent consulates in the world. And the Dutch had a consul there from the 1590s, before they had a consul in Constantinople, because trade in Aleppo was more important than diplomacy in Constantinople. And very grand processions of entry into, you see there, that is the journey of a Venetian to India. He's the nephew of the consul, Signore Bembo, in Aleppo, and he goes via Aleppo and stays with him, 1673. I put that map in to show you how Aleppo was a natural stopping point on the route from east to west, to India, to Iran, and so on. And this is a picture he commissioned. That is one of the first good views of Aleppo by Bembo, by a French artist for Bembo. And this is the procession of a consul entering Aleppo, the Venetian consul, I think. And you see how he's surrounded by Ottoman troops. Ottoman troops are there. It's a sort of mixed procession to show they're under the protection of the Ottoman government. And the Venetians had been very powerful in the 17th century, but they peter out in the 16th century. They peter out in the 17th century because the dynamic new traders from Holland and England and France take over the trade of Aleppo. And already consuls, they have a finger in every pie, literally. Some of the people here can remember that. And they're already hoovering up manuscripts for the Bibliothèque Royale, as it then was, in Paris, on Colbert's orders, buying rare cameos for Louis XIV, and competing, of course, with the English. And they complain that the English have already got the best manuscripts. And it's also a send of news, because you hear in Aleppo what's been happening in the Hejaz or the Gulf or India before anywhere else. And then these dispatches would go off to Versailles or Westminster. And interestingly, Nointel, but it's not all peace, Nointel records in his dispatches that he goes in state to Syriac or Maronite churches in Aleppo. The patriarchs preach sermons in praise of Louis XIV, but secretly they're saying, come and liberate us. We want French armies in Aleppo to liberate the Christians. So already there are elements of conflict. This is an incredible book. I recommend to all of you. It should be republished. Arvio had a sense of humor. He's French consul from 1679 to 1686. He speaks every language, Arabic, Persian, and so on. And he describes Aleppo from his point of view. It's an elaborate piece of machinery, lots of different pieces whirring at the same time. They all need each other. What keeps the machinery going? The oil of constant presence. Turks need a lot of presence. If they get a lot of presence, then everything is okay. And lots of dinner parties, lots of wine. He swears that Ottoman officials, of course, are drinking wine. European music, Turkish music, Jewish music, Greek dances, and so on. It really was a world city. And the English consulate in the Khan al-Gumruk, like the French one, a magnificent large khan near the entry of the souk. It's a great centre of scholarship. They're sending manuscripts to Oxford. They're making books about the pilgrimage that merchants would make every Easter to Jerusalem. This is a sellout, rapidly translated into French and German. This is an incredible book by a doctor who is there of 1740s and 50s. It's the most complete book in a foreign language about an Ottoman city. He was used by the Pasha and the governing Ottoman officials. He must have spoken some Arabic, and it's been translated into Arabic. It's such a good source, above all for diseases, flora and fauna. There was something called the Aleppo boil that distorted faces, and he tried to cure that. And this is another view of Aleppo in the 1670s. And it's not just a city of consuls, but also, and another thing the French consulate encouraged, it's not just getting manuscripts for the king and encouraging trade, they're also very closely linked to the local Christians, and this schism in the early 18th century among the Greek Orthodox of Aleppo. They're fed up with having Greek priests, services they don't really understand, and with French encouragement, they acknowledge the authority of the Pope and begin to have their own liturgy in Arabic. These are the Greek Catholics of Aleppo, who are a very dynamic population in Aleppo, and also later in Egypt, where they start running the customs. So this is really a local business elite moving up with the help of better priests, better education, and French protection in many cases. And the first printing press in Arabic in the Ottoman Empire was in Aleppo in 1703 to 6 for these Greek Catholics, and later it moves to a monastery in Beirut. And these consuls were incredible families, more research is being done on them. There was a very prominent Jewish family of Aleppo called Picciotto, and it was such a tolerant and unusual city. Anti-Jewish governments in Europe, like Austria or Russia, which penalized Jews, they would nevertheless be represented by a Jewish consul in Aleppo. So Esdras de Picciotto, as Austrian consul general, presided over Catholic services in Aleppo in 1818, for example. And they would be often consuls for different countries, wearing different uniforms of Austria, Prussia, the Netherlands, and so on. And now the Picciotto have left and are bankers in Switzerland. Union Bancaire Privée. And now trade, that's what it's all about, really. Jacques Gassot, 1550, wrote of Aleppo, Elle est fort marchande et plus que Constantinople ou autre ville de Levant. Great caravans of horses and camels would arrive daily from Anatolia, Armenia, Egypt, and India. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha had built the Khan al-Gumruk. Many other khans were built. 1590, a new port is opened for Aleppo, Iskenderun on the Mediterranean, often known as Alexandrette. And the merchants of Aleppo would communicate with Iskenderun by pigeon post with messages tucked under the wings for when ships arrived. And there are still pigeons called Skanderun pigeons. And these are some photographs from 1940 of the famous souks, 12 kilometers, souk of the rope makers, the saddlers, the spice merchants. It was said that a blind man could make his way by following the smell of the merchandise in the souks. And it's the third largest in the empire as a trading city and a souk after Constantinople and Cairo. And it's famous for its trading spirit. There are many proverbs about Aleppo. Halabi Chelabi, Washami Harami. The man from Aleppo is a gentleman, but the man from Damascus is a thief. And this rivalry is another dynamic of Syrian history, and in a way Damascus it's not just a victory for the Assad government, but also for Damascus over Aleppo. The old merchant elite has gone in the civil war, and there's going to be a new elite with much closer ties to Damascus. And Davio, this great consul who wrote his memoirs, wrote of Aleppo, what is extraordinary and distinguishes this people from all those of the Ottoman Empire is that they're the gentlest, the least malicious, and the most tractable of all this vast empire. Famous for their manners, and another proverb is, if you do business with a dog, kindly call him sir. And the English merchants are there. They love the local wine, and it's because the English are there that Aleppo is referred to by Shakespeare. Her husband's to Aleppo gone, master o'er the tiger. The main products are soap, spices, goat hair, above all silk coming from Iran, sold abroad. 17th century, Armenians become very prominent. They build churches, which in theory is illegal to have new churches, but they're built from 1616. They're doing very well, helping to run the customs. But there's a slight decline in the 17th century as Smyrna begins to become the main shopping center where Asia comes shopping for Europe and vice versa. There are some more Khans, the Khan of Khutbeh, more of the Khan al-Wazir, and English merchants helped. They were the first Europeans to rediscover Palmyra. This is the first view of Palmyra, possibly by a German living in Aleppo, done from their accounts. This is 1693. William Halifax wrote the first account of Palmyra. Here's another view around the same time. This is a mystery picture. If any of you know who it could be, please tell me. It's resurfaced in London. It's by Andrea Soldi, a Venetian working in Aleppo. But why? Is it a Westerner? Is it somebody local? Why is his hair so wild? Why is he wearing a beard, which Westerners didn't normally wear?
It's Russian.
He
looks Russian.
Maybe he's Russian. This is another picture. You see the citadel in the background. He's wearing very smart Ottoman dress. And in my opinion, they bought sets of Ottoman clothes and then were painted in them back in London or Venice or Paris. They didn't wear them in Aleppo because clothes were very tightly regulated, at least in theory. And yellow shoes, for example, were for Ottoman high officials. Turbans were for Muslims. But of course, he wanted to look smart and exotic for his friends back home. And this is also Andrea Soldi of an English merchant called Henry Hunter. He's in the desert. One of the main leisure occupations is hunting in the desert. He's got a Christian servant behind him because he's wearing dark blue and a bonnet, which was regulation Christian dress in the Ottoman Empire. And please note the horse, because one of the great products of Aleppo was Arabian horses. There you see a picture of the I think it's the Harley Arabian. Why was Aleppo a center of the horse trade? Because it's on the edge of the desert. Desert horses are faster, better built than cart horses or heavier European horses, and merchants would bring them to Aleppo. In theory, the best horses were reserved for the Sultan, but Western money could always speak, and already the global market is stronger than the Ottoman government, and horse racing is taking off in England around 1700, so they get the best horses from Aleppo and sometimes secretly sent to Iskenderun and then shipped to England or perhaps France. And the whole world of horse breeding is very specialized, but it was a world in which Arabs and Europeans could communicate. The obsession is with the genealogy of the horses to prove what a good family of racers it comes from. And Darvier says that many Arab merchants knew the genealogies of their horses far better than French nobles knew the genealogies of their families. Because French nobles invented everything. You didn't dare invent for a horse. And the stud book functions like that now. And again, it's Chantilly is now partly run by Arabs. Here's another horse picture. It's a whole genre. This is the emir, the Count Rzewuski, who comes down from Poland in 1818 to buy horses for the studs of Central Europe. And he wrote a wonderful account of Aleppo. I got it at the Institut du Monde Arabe. And there you see some of his illustrations. Horses are really his driving force. And that's a photograph about 1940 of a horse dealer selling his horse. There was a horse market outside the walls of the city. And Aleppo, it's not just riding and hunting. Food was a famous Aleppo occupation, an obsession, to say that your Aleppo food is better than Damascus food. In the 1970s, remembered Marie Mama Baché, who wrote Les Corbeaux d'Alep. One comment on her mother's kibbeh in Aleppo could send her to bed for a week, because she knew the remark had a hidden motive, and family recipes were never shared. That's Aleppo as a tourist center. This is Aleppo music, famous for its music for a critical audience, more critical than Cairo, it was said. And one musician, Sabah Fakhri from Aleppo, he was famous for singing, popularizing traditional music forms, and once in Caracas, he's said to have sung continuously for 10 hours. Why Caracas? Because one of the main exports of Aleppo is not just horses, but people, enterprising people from Aleppo leaving from the 17th century. Vast colonies in South America, as well as North America, England, France, and elsewhere. And another characteristic of these Levantine cities was multiple languages, Arabic, Kurdish, Persian. In fact, there was a special English unit recruited in the Second World War. I've only just heard about it, from Kurds and Armenians of Aleppo. They were called the Kalpaks, and they were going to blow up bridges and railway lines in Turkey in the war in case Germany invaded. Why were they recruited in Aleppo? Because they naturally spoke very good Turkish. There was also Italian was used as a lingua franca, and then from the 1830s, it's French. French language schools. French is the language of modernity as well as of France. The Ottoman elite and governors used to speak French. Mustafa Kemal spoke very good French. By 1831, according to Francis Newman, a missionary in the city, it had replaced Italian. And the many excellent French schools, Franciscaine Missionnaire de Marie, Alliance Israélite Universelle, and so on. And I know Aleppo families who tell me that in the house they only spoke French. Arabic was for the office or the street. And was really quite modern. That's another characteristic of Levantine cities. Here is a map around 1900 from a guidebook. You see that the most important buildings are mosques and consulates. This is the citadel, this is the souk. These are the new areas, quite different, Aziziye, Selimiye, named after Ottoman sultans, straight streets, incredible merchants' houses. But I would say the most important building of all is Caserne, because however much the economy is sliding out of Ottoman control, they always had troops on the ground. And this is what people forgot in Smyrna and Beirut sometimes. This is a postcard of the Turkish barracks. This is the city, and this is one of the clock towers which Abdul Hamid, the Sultan, built throughout the empire before 1900. And it's very characteristic. It shows both modern time beginning at midnight and traditional time beginning at sunset. Both time scales were used in the city and indeed throughout the Mediterranean. I'm not sure how you have a clock working on sunset time, but anyway, they did. And that clock tower, I hope, is still there. Is it? Yes. And this is a salon of a wealthy Christian family of Aleppo called the Marcopoli. They're merchants, they're dealing with more or less everything. They sell antiquities to Gertrude Bell, for example, and many of them were consuls until the 1950s. You see, it's very smart, very modern, and just as an example of what happened in Aleppo, there are still some letters from that period where Madame Homsi, the wife of a rich banker, invites Cemal Pasha, the Turkish governor in the First World War, to a concert. L'on fera de la musique, and the music will be modern Western music. This is the railway station, 1909. The railway arrives in Beirut. Well, there was a local railway before. This is the great Berlin to Baghdad railway, the great dream of Abdul Hamid and Kaiser Wilhelm, which was going to link the Ottoman Empire to its great new ally, Germany. And tragically, it was much used with the movements of Armenian refugees during the genocide in the First World War. Aleppo was a natural depot for movements of populations. Here you see the railway routes between the wars. You see again the central position of Aleppo. This would be the Berlin to Baghdad railway, connected to Istanbul, even beginning to be connected to Cairo by train. And Murder on the Orient Express begins with Poirot leaving his hotel in Aleppo to catch the Orient Express in Istanbul. Agatha Christie used this line very often, and the Taurus Express from Aleppo to Istanbul was a famous train. Its apogee was the Second World War, when it was one of the few means of communication through neutral Turkey with Axis Europe from Allied Middle East, and it was known as Le Bordel Ambulant. Another sign of modernity is the Altunian Hospital, which was very famous Anglo-Armenian hospital, a family with fingers everywhere, and they had the first X-ray machine in Syria. And curiously enough, Mustafa Kemal, as an Ottoman general who was in bad health, spent part of the First World War in that hospital. This is the famous Baron Hotel, which is now closed. It was for a long time run by the Mazloumian family, the most famous modern hotel in Aleppo, much described by foreign writers. This is a photograph from the incredible Poche collection, which I believe has been totally looted. It was a collection of a consulate family in the Khan al-Gumruk of antiquities, photographs, costumes, and so on. And here you see Kurdish chiefs with foreign consuls and an Ottoman officer. They're probably discussing the future of the city. It's before 1914. It's not an idyllic Ottoman twilight. There's lots of restlessness. Kurdish tribes are already ambitious. No one quite knows what the future holds. And this is Lawrence of Arabia as a young archaeologist at Karkemish, quite near Aleppo. He frequently stayed at the Baron Hotel. He loved Aleppo. He gives a very good description of it as a city where races and religions blended more naturally, in a more relaxed fashion than in other cities. And his first intelligence mission was 1913, taking weapons from an English ship off the Syrian coast to the English consulate in Aleppo, just in case there were riots or troubles, because the Ottoman government's been defeated in the Balkan Wars, expelled. Nobody knows what will happen. Unfortunately, it entered the war on the German side. This is a group of Ottoman officers in Aleppo, and there is Mustafa Kemal. He was the last Ottoman commander in the city, October, November 1918. This is Australian troops outside Aleppo. They're coming up from Damascus, the vast British, Arab, and Indian and Australian army. There's street fighting in Aleppo, and Mustafa Kemal himself takes part in it. And then the last battle of the First War in the Middle East is just north of Aleppo, and then the Ottomans leave after 402 years. But there was a lot of nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire by many people in Aleppo, not perhaps just for the empire, but for the vast economic free trade area it represented after 1918. Aleppo is cut off from its hinterland. And this is the entry of the Emir Faisal, the Hashemite from the Hejaz, who is in fact a brilliant and sophisticated multilingual ruler who ruled Syria briefly 1918 to 20. And here he is entering the city. And this is the Baron Hotel. You see the terrace is packed. It's not just a modern hotel isolated from the city. It's part of the political life of the city. And Nasser would later speak from the balcony. And Faisal, here he is, painted by Augustus John. He also believed in toleration. He said, all of us, whether we're Muslim, Christian or Jewish, we are all Arabs first. Anybody who tries to divide us is not a true Arab. That was the feeling of the independent government of 1918 to 20. But part of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, France wanted Syria and Lebanon as a reward for its efforts, promised by the Allies. And here you have the entrée de Général Gouraud, the first French High Commissioner for les États du Levant. And you see it's rather less well attended than the entrée de l'Emir Faisal. It was not a popular regime. It symbolized this economic disruption, lots of favors, I'm afraid to say, to Christians. And twice Damascus was bombarded by French forces. But again, Aleppo was lucky enough to escape. It's becoming quite modern. This is an Aleppo Muslim lady who's wearing modern dress in the courtyard of her house in the 1930s. Her grandson gave me the photograph. He's now living in London. It's part of the tourist boom between the wars. That's the Citadel. A British military cemetery. There's another battle, 1941, a relatively unknown war between England and Vichy France. It's touch and go. The English are terrified Germany will take over Syria as it had taken over Greece. So the French forces are defeated, finally, June 1941. And for a time, there's a curious Franco-British condominium in Syria and Lebanon, with, of course, Britain working with local politicians to expel the French and end the French mandate. And all this is manipulated by a very clever man. There will be a conference or exhibition on him called Sir Edward Spears, the man who actually flew de Gaulle to London from Bordeaux in 1940, but they quarrelled. And this was his revenge. And this is some more photos to show you the modernity of Lebanon, of Aleppo. This is the Altunian Hospital with its staff. It was later nationalized after Suez and destroyed. This is a wedding of the Altunian, Miss Titi Altunian and her father. And she may be familiar to some of you because the family often went on holiday to England and they were friends of Arthur Ransom, and he wrote about them in Swallows and Amazons and other children's books. And this is a party at the Club d'Alep in the 1950s. The local elite is still there. I've been assured Muslims, Christians and Jews could be members, all of them. And this is a fancy dress ball. A photo lent me by May Sikyas from Aleppo. I've had immense help in the book with people from Aleppo, not just through the internet, but who are actually living in London or Paris or elsewhere. But as nationalizations begin in the 1950s and 60s, and particularly the union with Egypt, 1958 to 61, that sends a lot of educated Aleppo people to Beirut and other cities. That's when Mustafa Akkad from Aleppo leaves and he becomes the Hollywood film producer of The Lion of the Desert and other things. More parties in Aleppo. This is a religious procession about 1962. The girls of the École Missionnaire de Marie. You see, it's quite normal to have a Christian procession in the streets of the mainly Muslim city. And this is what Aleppo has become. This is a typical, it was the last city to join the uprising against the Assad regime. It had had a sort of boom. More factories had been constructed outside the city, but at the same time there was increasing discontent. There was the desertification of the countryside, driving people into the cities, and the rest you've all been reading about it. I'm not going to go into the horrors of the Civil War. And basically, cities need armies. Once the state turns against a mixed city, there's not much hope, or the state weakens. And that's what happened to Izmir and indeed Istanbul and so on. Every day, Aleppo experienced unimaginable atrocities, both by the government with its barrel bombs and by insurgents who used old houses as places from which to fire, or indeed places in which to make gas bombs. That's the souk before the war and after. Little bits are coming back to life now. This old business elite of Aleppo is left, but some poorer people are returning, according to Bruno Deslandes, who's just left. This is the Beit Ghazaleh, one of the finest 17th century houses of the city. You see the state it's in. People are starting to restore, but there's not much confidence. Khalid Khalifa from Aleppo wrote, "One of the major crimes of the Arab regimes is destroying the deep memory of our people and our city. The city I wrote about in my novel is another city, a city that does not exist." And all I can say is let us hope that peace returns and prosperity to this incredible trading city where people lived together in peace for so long. Thank you very much. Not all of the Christians. Most of the Armenians have gone because they can go to Armenia. The first president of independent Armenia was born in Aleppo. All the Jews have gone, but they had stayed even after 67 in some cases. And local Christians some are coming back. I don't really know, but an awful lot feel even more threatened than other inhabitants and often have good contacts abroad, so try to leave. Yes, it does. Well, Bruno Deslandes, I talked to him just before this talk. Yes, it does. And the Aga Khan Foundation, which did a lot before the war, is back. And UNESCO. Yep. And the Department of Antiquities is still functioning. They do, yes, they do have plans. Yep. But it's not the Syrian government alone which won the war. It's Russian troops above all, and Iranian and Hezbollah. So it's not as strong as it may appear. Well, I wish they wrote memoirs or diaries or letters. Maybe they have. There are some merchant letters from the 16th century have been published. They're all about when the ship has arrived in Iskenderun and pigeons.
I went to Aleppo in 1958.
Before UAR?
No, during UAR.
During UAR. Did you see Nasser there?
No.
It's said that...
I've seen him in Cairo.
It said that when Nasser arrived in Aleppo, the enthusiasm was so great that they carried his car on their shoulders as well as him. I was promised that was true. Bon. Let's